In the rolling countryside of medieval France, where stone churches rise like prayers against the sky and ancient oaks whisper secrets of centuries past, there lived a peasant girl whose destiny would eclipse the grandest dreams of kings. The year was 1412, and the world moved to rhythms older than memory. The turning of seasons, the tolling of bells, the eternal dance between earth and heaven that had governed human hearts since time began. Joan of Arc emerged from this timeless landscape like a figure from legend, yet she was utterly real, breathing the same air as the farmers who tilled the soil and the nobles who ruled from their towering castles. Her story unfolds against the backdrop of a France torn asunder, a realm caught between the dying light of one age and the uncertain dawn of another. To understand her tale is to journey through a world where the sacred and the mundane intertwined with seamless grace, where visions could change the course of history, and where a simple village girl could rise to command armies and crown kings. The France into which Joan was born was a land scarred by decades of war and shadowed by the spectre of foreign domination. The great conflict that would later be known as the 100 Years' War had already raged for more than 7 decades, transforming the fertile fields of France into battlegrounds where English longbowmen and French knights clashed beneath banners that bore the weight of ancient claims and bitter grievances. This was not merely a war between nations, but a struggle for the very soul of France, a contest that would determine whether the realm of the Franks would remain sovereign or fall beneath the crown of England. The roots of this conflict stretched back to the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed the English Channel and claimed the throne of England. This momentous event created a complex web of feudal relationships that would entangle England and France for centuries to come. English kings held vast territories in France as vassals of the French crown, yet they wore crowns in their own right across the Channel. This delicate balance of power held for generations, but like all such arrangements built upon competing claims and divided loyalties, it contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The immediate cause of the war lay in the question of succession to the French throne. When Charles IV of France died in 1328, without a male heir, 2 primary claimants emerged. Philip VI, nephew of the deceased king, ascended the throne with the support of the French nobility, invoking the ancient Salic law that barred inheritance through the female line. Yet across the Channel, Edward III of England pressed his own claim through his mother Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France. What began as a dynastic dispute would evolve into something far greater, a war that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe and forge the modern identities of both England and France. The early decades of the conflict had witnessed England's stunning military victories at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356, where English longbowmen devastated the flower of French chivalry. These battles shattered the medieval world's conception of warfare, proving that disciplined common soldiers could triumph over mounted knights who had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The capture of King John II of France at Poitiers seemed to herald the complete collapse of French resistance, yet the realm endured, adapting and learning from its defeats. By the time Joan of Arc drew her first breath in the village of Domrémy, the war had entered a new and even more desperate phase. Henry V of England had renewed the English claim with devastating effect, winning the great victory at Agincourt in 1415 that once again demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of English military tactics. More ominously still, Henry had secured the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which disinherited the Dauphin Charles and recognized Henry as heir to the French throne. When both Henry V and Charles VI died in 1422, the infant Henry VI was proclaimed King of France and England, while the disinherited Dauphin maintained his own court south of the Loire River. France was thus divided not merely by war, but by the fundamental question of legitimacy. 2 kings claimed the same throne, each backed by powerful allies and foreign armies. The English controlled much of northern France, including the great city of Paris, while their Burgundian allies dominated the east. The Dauphin Charles held sway over much of the south, but his authority was contested and his resources limited. Between these competing claims lay a landscape scarred by decades of warfare, where roving bands of soldiers, both English and French, pillaged the countryside and terrorized the population. Into this fractured world, Joan of Arc was born, in the small village of Domrémy that lay in the Duchy of Bar, technically within the Holy Roman Empire, but culturally and linguistically French. The village occupied a curious position in the complex political geography of the time, surrounded by territories loyal to different claimants, yet maintaining a precarious independence. This borderland existence would profoundly shape Joan's understanding of the world and her sense of France as something greater than the sum of its competing parts. Domrémy itself was a place where time seemed to move with the rhythm of the seasons, rather than the urgency of political events. The village consisted of perhaps 50 families, their stone houses clustered around a modest church dedicated to Saint Remy. The landscape was one of gentle hills and fertile valleys, where the Meuse River wound its way through meadows dotted with grazing cattle and fields golden with grain. Ancient forests crowned the hilltops, their depths still home to wolves and wild boar, remnants of the primeval wilderness that had once covered all of Europe. Joan's family, the Darcs, were peasants of what might be called the middle rank, neither serfs bound to the soil nor wealthy yeomen, but free farmers who owned their land and owed service to their lord in times of need. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of standing in the village, serving as a doyen or village leader, and maintaining the modest prosperity that allowed his family to live above the level of mere subsistence. Her mother, Isabelle Romay, was remembered by those who knew her as a woman of deep piety and gentle nature, who ensured that her children grew up within the protective embrace of the church. The world of Joan's childhood was one where the supernatural was as real and immediate as the turning of the plough or the ringing of the church bell. Medieval Christianity had woven itself so thoroughly into the fabric of daily life that the boundary between the earthly and the divine seemed almost permeable. Saints interceded in human affairs with the same regularity as neighbors helped with the harvest, and miracles were not extraordinary events, but part of the natural order of a world where God's providence touched every aspect of existence. This was a Christianity that bore little resemblance to the rationalized theology of later centuries. It was instead a faith of pilgrimage and relic, of miracle and vision, where the sacred manifested itself through physical objects and mystical experiences rather than abstract doctrine. Every village had its local saints and particular devotions, its holy wells and miraculous shrines that drew pilgrims from near and far. The rhythm of the year was marked not merely by the changing seasons, but by the great festivals of the church, Christmas and Easter, Pentecost and All Saints, each bringing its own rituals and celebrations that bound the community together in common purpose. Joan grew up within this world of faith made manifest, attending Mass in the village church where candlelight flickered before painted saints and the ancient words of the liturgy rose like incense toward heaven. She learned her prayers from her mother, memorizing the Ave Maria and Pater Noster in the Latin she could recite but not fully understand. More importantly, she absorbed the deep conviction that God took an active interest in human affairs, that prayer could change the course of events, and that the saints in heaven maintained their concern for the struggles of those still bound to earth. The particular devotions of her region centered on several figures who would later play crucial roles in her mystical experiences. Saint Michael the Archangel was especially beloved in the borderlands, his role as a warrior saint making him a natural protector for communities threatened by the violence of war. Saint Margaret of Antioch, one of the most popular virgin martyrs of the medieval period, was invoked by women in childbirth and celebrated for her triumph over the dragon that had devoured her. Saint Catherine of Alexandria, the learned virgin who had debated with pagan philosophers before suffering martyrdom, represented the possibility that even young women could possess wisdom that confounded the mighty. These saints were not distant figures from ancient history, but living presences who could be called upon in times of need. Their feast days were celebrated with particular fervour in Domrémy, their stories told and retold until they became as familiar as family history. Joan absorbed these tales along with the fundamental conviction that God could call anyone, however humble their origins, to perform great deeds in his service. The Bible was full of such examples. David the shepherd boy who slew Goliath, Deborah the judge who led Israel to victory, Judith who saved her people by slaying Holofernes. Yet for all its mystical dimensions, Joan's childhood was also thoroughly grounded in the practical realities of peasant life. She learned to spin and sew from her mother, acquiring the skills that would make her a valuable member of any household. She helped tend the family's small flock of sheep and cattle, spending long hours in the fields where she would later claim to have received her first visions. She worked in the gardens that provided vegetables for the family table and helped with the endless round of tasks that sustained rural life: baking bread, brewing ale, preserving food for winter, tending the sick, and caring for the young. The village of Domrémy was largely insulated from the great events that convulsed the wider world, yet it could not remain entirely untouched by the war that had raged for so long. Soldiers passed through periodically, sometimes friendly, sometimes hostile, always hungry and often dangerous. The villagers learned to hide their valuables when armed men approached and to be wary of strangers who might be scouts for larger forces. Tales of atrocities committed elsewhere reached even this remote corner of France, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that shadowed even the most ordinary activities. Joan would have heard these stories from travelers and traders, absorbing the growing conviction that France was suffering under God's judgment for some great sin. The war was not simply a political conflict, but a spiritual crisis, a sign that the natural order had been disrupted and that only divine intervention could restore the peace that had once blessed the realm. This understanding of the war as fundamentally a religious rather than merely political struggle would prove central to her later mission and would shape her approach to the complex problems of military strategy and diplomatic negotiation. The specific nature of France's spiritual crisis was understood differently by different groups, but most agreed that the realm's troubles stemmed from the absence of a legitimate king, properly consecrated by God. The ancient ceremony of coronation was not merely a political ritual, but a sacramental act that transformed a mere nobleman into God's anointed representative on earth. Without this consecration, no ruler could truly claim divine sanction for his authority, and without divine sanction, the realm would continue to suffer under the weight of God's displeasure. This belief in the sacred nature of kingship was not unique to France, but found its most elaborate expression there, where the ceremony of coronation at Reims Cathedral had acquired almost mystical significance over the centuries. The cathedral itself was said to possess a vial of holy oil that had been brought from heaven by a dove at the baptism of Clovis, the first Christian king of the Franks. Only when anointed with this sacred chrism could a king truly claim to rule by divine right, and only at Reims could the full ritual be properly performed. The Dauphin Charles had never undergone this ceremony, remaining technically uncrowned despite exercising royal authority in those parts of France that acknowledged his legitimacy. Reims lay within territory controlled by the English and their Burgundian allies, making a coronation there seem impossible under current circumstances. Yet without this consecration, Charles remained vulnerable to charges that he was merely a pretender, a weakness that his enemies exploited at every opportunity. The The question of legitimacy thus became not merely a matter of dynastic law, but of religious faith, creating a crisis that demanded divine rather than merely human resolution. Joan's mystical experiences began to manifest when she was approximately 13 years old, at the age when medieval society expected young people to assume adult responsibilities and make the fundamental choices that would shape their entire lives. The first vision came to her while she was in her father's garden, a setting so ordinary that it seemed to emphasize the extraordinary nature of what she claimed to experience. A voice spoke to her from the direction of the church, accompanied by a brilliant light that seemed to emanate from heaven itself. The voice identified itself as that of Saint Michael, the archangel, the great warrior of God who had cast Satan from heaven and who continued to battle the forces of evil throughout creation. Michael commanded Joan to be a good girl, to attend church regularly, and to prepare herself for a great mission that God would reveal to her in time. The vision was brief, but overwhelming in its intensity, leaving Joan shaken and uncertain about what she had experienced, yet convinced of its divine origin. Subsequent visions brought her into contact with Saints Margaret and Catherine, the virgin martyrs who would become her constant companions and counselors throughout her brief but extraordinary career. These saints appeared to her with increasing frequency, always in moments of solitude when she was engaged in the ordinary activities of rural life. They spoke to her in French rather than Latin, addressing her with the familiar tenderness of elder sisters rather than the formal language of liturgical prayer. The content of these communications initially focused on personal conduct and spiritual preparation rather than political action. Joan was instructed to maintain her virginity, to live a life of exemplary piety, and to develop the spiritual strength that would be necessary for the trials that lay ahead. The saints emphasized that God had chosen her for a particular purpose, but that this purpose would be revealed gradually as she proved herself worthy of divine trust. As Joan entered adolescence, the visions became more specific and more focused on the political situation of France. Saint Michael began to speak of the kingdom's suffering under foreign domination and of God's intention to restore the rightful king to his throne. Joan was told that she had been chosen to accomplish this restoration, that she would drive the English from French soil and ensure the Dauphin's coronation at Reims. The magnitude of this mission seemed impossible for a peasant girl, yet the saints assured her that God would provide the means to accomplish what human strength alone could never achieve. The psychological and spiritual impact of these experiences on a young girl from a remote village can hardly be overstated. Joan was being called to abandon everything familiar and secure, to venture into a world of politics and warfare that was utterly foreign to her experience, and to attempt what the greatest nobles and most skilled military leaders of France had failed to accomplish. The weight of this calling pressed upon her with increasing intensity as the visions continued and became more insistent. Yet the saints who appeared to her provided not only commands but also comfort and guidance. They assured her that she would not face her trials alone, that divine protection would shield her from harm, and that her mission would ultimately succeed despite all apparent obstacles. This promise of divine assistance transformed what might have been a crushing burden into a source of extraordinary confidence and determination. Joan began to see herself not as a mere peasant girl, but as God's chosen instrument, endowed with authority that transcended all earthly hierarchies. The transformation in Joan's understanding of herself and her place in the world was gradual but profound. She continued to perform her ordinary duties within the household, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while grappling with the extraordinary nature of her calling. Her family noticed changes in her behavior, a deeper piety, longer periods spent in prayer, and occasional moments of distraction when she seemed to be listening to voices that others could not hear. Yet they attributed these changes to the natural development of religious feeling in a girl approaching womanhood, rather than to any supernatural cause. Joan herself struggled to understand the full implications of what was being asked of her. The saints had commanded her to go to the Dauphin and offer her services in driving out the English, but the practical difficulties of such a mission seemed insurmountable. She was a peasant girl with no connections to the court, no military experience, and no resources beyond her family's modest holdings. How could she possibly gain access to the Dauphin, let alone convince him to entrust her with a military command? The answer to these questions would come through a series of providential encounters that seemed to confirm the divine nature of her mission. The first of these involved Robert de Baudricourt, the captain of the nearby fortress of Vaucouleurs, who controlled one of the few routes through enemy territory that could provide access to the Dauphin's court. Joan would need to convince this hardened military commander to provide her with an escort and safe passage, a task that would require all the persuasive power that her mystical experiences had given her. The siege of Orléans, which had begun in October 1428, provided the immediate crisis that would give urgency to Joan's mission. Orléans was one of the strongest fortresses in France and the key to controlling the Loire Valley, which formed the last major barrier to English domination of the entire realm. If Orléans fell, the road to the Dauphin's strongholds in the south would lie open, and the cause of French resistance might collapse entirely. The city's defenders had held out with remarkable tenacity against overwhelming odds, but by early 1429, their situation was becoming desperate. News of the siege reached even remote villages like Domrémy, carried by refugees and traders who painted increasingly dark pictures of the city's plight. Joan heard these reports with growing distress, interpreting them as signs that the time had come for her to act on the commands she had received from her saintly visitors. The voices became more insistent, urging her to waste no more time in seeking out the Dauphin and offering her divinely inspired assistance. In May 1428, Joan made her first attempt to convince Robert de Baudricourt to provide her with passage to the Dauphin's court. The meeting was brief and unsuccessful, with Baudricourt dismissing her claims as the fantasies of a deluded peasant girl. He suggested that her father should give her a sound beating to cure her of such nonsense, and sent her away without further consideration. Yet Joan was not discouraged by this initial rejection, interpreting it as merely the first of the trials she would need to overcome in fulfilling her divine mission. She returned to Domrémy, but the voices continued to urge her toward action, and the news from Orléans grew increasingly desperate. By January 1429, Joan could no longer delay, and she made a second journey to Vaucouleurs, this time accompanied by her uncle Durand Laxart, who had been persuaded of the sincerity of her calling, even if he remained uncertain about its divine origin. This second meeting with Baudricourt proved more productive, partly because Joan's persistence and obvious conviction had begun to make an impression on those around her. The atmosphere at Vaucouleurs had also changed in the months since Joan's first visit. The military situation continued to deteriorate, with French forces suffering a series of defeats that seemed to confirm the hopelessness of continued resistance. In such desperate circumstances, even the most unlikely sources of help began to seem worth considering. Baudricourt agreed to test Joan's claims by presenting her with various challenges and observing her responses, looking for signs that might indicate divine favor, or at least exceptional natural ability. Joan's behavior during these tests began to convince some observers that she possessed unusual gifts. She demonstrated knowledge of events occurring at a distance that she could not have obtained through normal means, and she spoke with such conviction about her mission that even skeptics began to wonder whether she might indeed be divinely inspired. More importantly, she began to attract followers among the common soldiers and townspeople who saw in her someone who shared their own humble origins, yet claimed authority that transcended all earthly distinctions. The final factor that convinced Baudricourt to grant Joan's request was a prediction she made about a French defeat at the Battle of Rouvray, which became known as the Battle of the Herrings. Joan claimed that her voices had informed her of this disaster before news of it could have reached Vaucouleurs through normal channels. and when confirmation arrived several days later, it seemed to validate her claims to supernatural insight. Baudricourt finally agreed to provide her with an escort to the Dauphin's court at Chinon, though he remained uncertain whether he was launching a divinely inspired mission or merely indulging the delusions of a peasant girl. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon required crossing territory controlled by English and Burgundian forces, making it extremely dangerous for a small party travelling without significant military protection. Joan and her escort of 6 men-at-arms had to rely on speed, local knowledge, and considerable luck to avoid the roving bands of soldiers who made travel so hazardous. The trip normally required several weeks, but they completed it in just 11 days, travelling mostly at night and taking shelter where they could find it during the day. Joan's appearance at the court of Chinon in March 1429 created a sensation that reverberated throughout the political and religious establishments of France. Here was a peasant girl who claimed to have been sent by God to save the kingdom, demanding an audience with the Dauphin and insisting that she could accomplish what the greatest nobles and most experienced military commanders had failed to achieve. The very audacity of her claims was either evidence of divine inspiration or of dangerous delusion, and the court was divided in its assessment of which interpretation was correct. The Dauphin Charles himself was a complex figure whose character had been shaped by years of adversity and uncertainty. Born in 1403, he had grown to manhood during the darkest period of French fortunes, watching his father's increasing madness and his mother's questionable loyalty create chaos within the royal family. The Treaty of Troyes had formally disinherited him, and persistent rumors questioned his legitimacy as the late king's son. These experiences had created in him a cautious, suspicious nature that made him reluctant to trust anyone completely, yet also desperate enough to consider even the most unlikely sources of assistance. Charles was physically unprepossessing, lacking the imposing presence that contemporary expectations associated with kingship. He was short and slight, with a pale complexion and nervous manner that seemed to confirm his enemies' claims that he was unfit to rule. Yet beneath this unpromising exterior lay a keen intelligence and a stubborn determination to reclaim his inheritance despite all obstacles. He had survived assassination attempts, political betrayals, and military disasters through a combination of cunning and luck. But he needed something more than mere survival if he was to transform his precarious position into genuine royal authority. Joan's initial meeting with the Dauphin became the subject of numerous legends, but the essential facts seem clear enough. She was brought into the Great Hall at Chinon, where Charles had deliberately concealed himself among his courtiers to test whether she possessed the supernatural insight she claimed. According to multiple witnesses, Joan immediately identified him despite having never seen him before. Approaching him directly and addressing him as the rightful king of France. This recognition was taken as strong evidence of divine favor, though skeptics suggested that she might have been coached by her escort, or that Charles's distinctive appearance made identification relatively easy. More significant than this initial recognition was the private conversation that followed, during which Joan apparently shared information with Charles that convinced him of her divine mission. The content of this conversation was never revealed, but its effect was immediate and profound. Charles emerged from the meeting transformed, displaying a confidence and determination that had been notably absent from his previous conduct. Whatever Joan had told him, it had apparently resolved the doubts about his legitimacy that had plagued him throughout his life. The court's reaction to Joan's arrival was mixed, reflecting the complex political and religious currents that ran through the Dauphin's entourage. Some saw her as a divinely sent deliverer who would restore France to its former glory, while others viewed her as a dangerous enthusiast whose claims might bring divine judgment upon the realm if they proved false. The clergy were particularly divided, with some prelates declaring her a saint, and others, warning that she might be an instrument of Satan sent to deceive the faithful. To resolve these conflicting assessments, Charles arranged for Joan to be examined by a panel of theologians and church officials at Poitiers. This examination, which lasted for several weeks, was designed to determine whether her claims were consistent with Orthodox Christian doctrine and whether her mission showed signs of divine approval. The theologians questioned her extensively about her visions, her understanding of her mission, and her willingness to submit to church authority. They also investigated her personal life, seeking evidence of the exceptional virtue that would be expected in someone chosen for such an extraordinary calling. Joan's performance before this learned panel was remarkable for someone of her humble background and limited education. She answered their questions with a combination of simplicity and sophistication that impressed even her critics, demonstrating an understanding of theological concepts that seemed to exceed what could be expected from a peasant girl. More importantly, she consistently maintained that her mission came from God rather than from her own ambitions, and she expressed willingness to submit to church authority, while insisting that she must obey the divine commands she had received. The examination concluded with a cautious endorsement of Joan's mission, though the theologians were careful to avoid making any definitive pronouncements about the divine nature of her calling. They declared that her claims were not contrary to Orthodox faith and that her character showed evidence of exceptional virtue. More practically, they noted that her mission aimed at legitimate political goals, the expulsion of foreign invaders and the coronation of the rightful king, that were consistent with Christian principles. The report recommended that Charles give her an opportunity to prove her claims through action, while maintaining careful oversight to ensure that she did not exceed the bounds of proper conduct. Armed with this qualified approval from the church authorities, Charles began to make practical preparations for testing Joan's military abilities. She was provided with armor appropriate to her claimed mission, a task that required considerable skill since armor was normally custom fitted to its wearer, and Joan's unusual status as a female warrior created additional complications. The armorers at Tours crafted a suit of white plate armor that became one of her most recognizable attributes, symbolizing both her martial calling and her claim to purity. Joan also requested a sword that she claimed would be found buried behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine at Fierbois, a shrine dedicated to one of the saints who had appeared to her in visions. The sword was indeed discovered where she had indicated, bearing markings that seemed to confirm its sacred character. This apparent miracle enhanced her reputation for supernatural insight and provided her with a weapon that carried symbolic as well as practical significance. The sword of St. Catherine became as much a part of her identity as her white armor, representing the divine authority that she claimed to wield. The standard that Joan designed for herself became another powerful symbol of her mission and her understanding of her role in God's plan for France. The banner depicted Christ in judgment, holding the world in his hands, flanked by angels and bearing the names of Jesus and Mary. This imagery emphasized that her war was ultimately a religious rather than merely political struggle, fought in the name of Christ the King rather than for earthly glory or territorial gain. The standard served as a visual proclamation of her beliefs and as a rallying point for those who shared her conviction that France's liberation required divine intervention. Joan's insistence on maintaining her virginity, symbolized by her adoption of male clothing and her refusal to marry, reflected her understanding of her mission as a religious vocation that required complete dedication to God's service. Medieval Christianity placed enormous emphasis on virginity as a spiritual state that freed the soul from earthly attachments and made possible a more perfect union with the divine. Joan's vow of chastity was thus not merely a personal choice, but a public declaration that she had surrendered her entire being to God's will and could therefore serve as a pure channel for divine power. The transformation of a peasant girl into a military leader required more than symbolic equipment and religious validation. Joan needed to master the complex arts of warfare and leadership that had traditionally been the exclusive preserve of the nobility. She threw herself into this training with the same intensity that she brought to her spiritual discipline, learning to handle weapons and armor, to manage horses, and to understand the basic principles of military strategy and tactics. Her tutors in these martial arts were experienced soldiers who had served in the Long War against the English, men who could teach her not only the technical skills she would need, but also the harsh realities of medieval warfare. They found her an apt pupil, possessed of natural courage and an intuitive understanding of military psychology that more than compensated for her lack of formal training. More importantly, she brought to warfare a moral authority that transformed the nature of military command, inspiring soldiers to fight not merely for pay or plunder, but for a cause they believed to be sanctified by God. The army that Charles assembled for Joan's first campaign was modest in size, but exceptional in spirit. It consisted of perhaps 4,000 men, including both professional soldiers and volunteers who had been drawn by her reputation and her message. Many of the volunteers were common people like herself, peasants and artisans who saw in her someone who represented their own hopes for deliverance from the sufferings of war. Yet the force also included experienced commanders and noble warriors who were willing to serve under her leadership despite the unprecedented nature of her authority. Joan's approach to military leadership differed markedly from the conventions of her time in several important respects. She insisted that the army observe strict moral discipline, forbidding the pillaging and casual violence that were normally accepted aspects of medieval warfare. She required soldiers to attend mass regularly and to confess their sins before battle, treating military service as a form of religious devotion rather than merely a secular occupation. Most unusually, she attempted to minimize casualties on both sides, preferring to achieve victory through moral rather than purely physical means. This last aspect of her military philosophy was most clearly demonstrated in her practice of sending letters to enemy commanders before attacking their positions, urging them to surrender peacefully and warning them of the consequences of continued resistance. These communications were remarkable documents that combined diplomatic courtesy with prophetic authority, addressing even the most powerful English nobles as if she possessed authority equal to their own. They also reflected her conviction that her war was ultimately against the sin of rebellion against God's will, rather than against the English people themselves, whom she viewed as misguided rather than inherently evil. The relief of Orléans, which began on April 29, 1429, would become Joan's greatest military triumph and the foundation of her enduring reputation. The city had been under siege for more than 6 months, its defenders reduced to near starvation, and its walls battered by English artillery. The garrison commanded by Jean de Dunois had fought with desperate valor, but they were vastly outnumbered and running short of supplies. The arrival of Joan's relief force promised to tip the balance, but only if it could break through the English siege lines and reach the city. The English siege of Orléans represented one of the most sophisticated military operations of the medieval period, demonstrating how warfare was evolving in response to advances in artillery and fortification. The English had constructed a series of fortified positions called boulevards that surrounded the city and prevented supplies from reaching the defenders. These positions were themselves heavily fortified and garrisoned by experienced troops, making them formidable obstacles for any relief force. The siege had become a war of attrition, with the English confident that time was on their side and that the city would eventually be forced to surrender. Joan's arrival transformed the psychological dynamics of the siege in ways that purely military analysis could not have predicted. Her presence convinced the French defenders that God had finally intervened on their behalf, while creating uncertainty and fear among the English besiegers who had heard rumors of her supernatural powers. The moral transformation was immediate and profound. with French soldiers who had been demoralized by months of failure suddenly displaying the confidence and aggressiveness that had once characterized English forces. The first action of the campaign involved the capture of the Boulevard of the Tourelles, the strongest of the English fortifications and the key to lifting the siege. Joan participated directly in the assault, bearing her standard and encouraging the attackers despite the intense resistance offered by the English garrison. During the fighting, she was wounded by a crossbow bolt that penetrated between the plates of her armor, but she quickly returned to the battle after having the wound dressed, displaying the physical courage that would characterize all her military actions. The fall of the Tourelles on May 7, 1429, marked the effective end of the siege, as the English abandoned their remaining positions and withdrew from the vicinity of Orleans. The victory was complete and decisive, achieved in just 4 days after Joan's arrival, despite the months of stalemate that had preceded it. More importantly, it demonstrated that English military supremacy was not absolute, and that French resistance could succeed when properly motivated and led. The liberation of Orléans had profound consequences that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. It marked the first major French victory in decades and proved that the English were not invincible despite their previous successes. The victory also validated Joan's claims to divine mission in the eyes of many who had previously remained skeptical, transforming her from a curious novelty into a genuinely influential figure in French politics and military affairs. News of the victory spread rapidly throughout France and beyond, inspiring French resistance in other occupied territories while creating alarm in English-controlled regions. Joan's reputation began to take on legendary proportions, with reports of her supernatural powers growing in the telling, until she became a figure of almost mythical significance. These developments worked to her advantage by making her a powerful symbol of French resistance, but they also created expectations that would prove increasingly difficult to fulfill. The psychological impact of Orléans was particularly significant for the Dauphin Charles, who had spent years doubting his own legitimacy and his ability to reclaim his inheritance. Joan's success provided him with concrete evidence that God favored his cause, giving him the confidence to pursue more aggressive policies and to present himself more forcefully as the rightful king of France. The victory also enhanced his credibility with potential allies who had previously questioned whether supporting his cause would be worth the risks involved. Following the triumph at Orléans, Joan moved quickly to capitalize on the momentum she had created, launching a campaign to clear the English from the Loire Valley and open the route to Reims. This campaign, known as the Loire Campaign, would last from May to June 1429 and would result in a series of French victories that seemed to confirm Joan's divine mission, while fundamentally altering the strategic balance of the war. The first objective was the town of Jargeau, held by an English garrison under the command of William de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk. The attack on Jargeau demonstrated Joan's growing confidence and skill as a military commander, as she coordinated the actions of multiple units while maintaining the moral authority that made her soldiers willing to follow her into the most dangerous situations. The town fell after a brief siege, with Suffolk himself captured and many of his men killed or wounded. The English defeat at Jargeau was followed by victories at Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency, as English garrisons abandoned their positions rather than face Joan's apparently unstoppable forces. These successes created a cascade effect throughout the region, with French towns that had accepted English rule declaring their allegiance to the Dauphin and English strongholds finding themselves isolated and vulnerable. The strategic situation in central France was being transformed with startling rapidity. The culminating engagement of the Loire campaign came at the Battle of Patay on June 18, 1429, where a French force under Joan's overall command encountered and destroyed an English army that had been attempting to halt the French advance. The battle was a complete rout, with English casualties numbering in the thousands, while French losses were minimal. The victory demonstrated that French forces, could defeat the English in open battle when properly led and motivated, overturning decades of English military dominance. Patay was particularly significant because it marked the first time since the early years of the war that a French army had achieved such a decisive victory against English forces in a pitched battle. The engagement validated Joan's military leadership while providing concrete evidence that the tide of war was turning in France's favour. The psychological impact was enormous, with French morale soaring while English confidence began to crack under the strain of repeated defeats. The success of the Loire campaign created the conditions necessary for Joan to pursue her ultimate objective, the coronation of the Dauphin at Reims Cathedral. This had always been the central goal of her mission, the act that would transform Charles from a mere claimant into God's anointed king, and thereby resolve the legitimacy crisis that had plagued France for decades. The military victories had been means to this end, clearing the path to Reims and demonstrating divine favour for the Dauphin's cause. The journey to Reims required crossing territory that had been under English or Burgundian control for many years, making it a risky enterprise despite the recent French successes. Towns and cities along the route would need to be persuaded to open their gates to the Dauphin's forces, either through negotiation or through military pressure. The expedition would also need to move quickly before English forces could organise effective resistance or before the momentum created by Joan's victories began to dissipate. Joan's advocacy for the Reims expedition met with resistance from some of the Dauphin's advisors, who preferred to consolidate the gains already made, rather than risk everything on what they saw as a premature advance into enemy territory. They argued that the prudent course would be to secure the Loire Valley and build up French strength before attempting such an ambitious campaign. Joan, however, remained convinced that delay would only allow the English to recover from their defeats and organise new resistance. The debate over strategy reflected deeper differences in how Joan and the traditional military leadership understood the nature of the war they were fighting. The professional soldiers thought in terms of territorial conquest and military advantage, seeking to maximise French strength while minimising risks. Joan, by contrast, saw the conflict as fundamentally spiritual, requiring bold action to demonstrate faith in divine providence rather than careful calculation of material factors. Charles ultimately decided to support Joan's proposal, partly because of her proven track record of success and partly because he recognised that his own political position required the legitimacy that only coronation could provide. The expedition to Reims was organised with remarkable speed, departing from Gien on June 29, 1429, just 11 days after the victory at Patay. The army that marched toward Reims numbered approximately 12,000 men, making it the largest force that the Dauphin had commanded since the beginning of his reign. The march to Reims became a triumphal procession as town after town opened its gates to the advancing French forces. Auxerre, Troyes, Châlons-en-Champagne, and other major centres of English power in the region submitted without resistance, their populations welcoming the Dauphin as their rightful sovereign. The rapid collapse of English authority in the region demonstrated how hollow their control had become, maintained more by fear and habit than by genuine strength or popular support. The city of Troyes provided a particularly dramatic example of this transformation. The town had been the site of the infamous treaty that had disinherited the Dauphin and recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. Its surrender to Charles represented a symbolic rejection of that treaty and a restoration of the legitimate succession. The citizens who had once celebrated English victories now welcomed the approach of the king they had been told was a usurper and a rebel. Joan's role in these negotiations was crucial, as her reputation for supernatural powers and divine mission made even the most skeptical observers reluctant to oppose her directly. Her letters to various towns and cities combined diplomatic courtesy with prophetic authority, promising divine favour to those who submitted peacefully while warning of the consequences of continued resistance. The moral authority she commanded often proved more effective than military threats in securing the submission of enemy strongholds. The approach to Reims itself was carefully orchestrated to maximize the symbolic impact of the Dauphin's arrival. The city's gates were opened on July 16, 1429, and Charles entered in triumph, accompanied by Joan and the great nobles who had joined his cause. The cathedral bells rang out across the city, announcing the arrival of the king, who would finally receive the consecration that would transform him from a claimant into God's anointed ruler of France. Reims Cathedral stood as one of the architectural marvels of medieval Europe, its soaring Gothic spires reaching toward heaven like prayers made manifest in stone. The building had been constructed over the course of nearly a century, its every detail designed to inspire awe and reverence in those who entered. The great rose window cast coloured light across the nave, while the sculpted figures of saints and angels seemed to watch over the ceremonies conducted within the sacred space. The cathedral's history was intimately connected with the monarchy of France, as it had been the site of royal coronations for more than 6 centuries. The ceremony that would take place there drew its significance not merely from political tradition, but from the religious belief that kings ruled by divine right and that their authority derived from God rather than from human consent. The sacred oil used in the coronation was believed to have been brought from heaven itself, making the anointing a sacramental act that transformed the recipient into something more than a mere mortal ruler. The coronation of Charles VII on July 17, 1429, represented the culmination of Joan's mission and the fulfillment of the commands she had received from her saintly voices. The ceremony followed the ancient ritual that had been performed for centuries, with each element carefully preserved to maintain the connection between the new king and his predecessors. The Archbishop of Reims, Regnault de Chartres, performed the consecration, anointing Charles with the holy oil while reciting the prayers that called down divine blessing upon his reign. Joan's presence at the coronation was unprecedented, as no woman had ever played such a prominent role in the ceremony. She stood near the altar holding her standard, visible to all who attended as the person whose efforts had made this moment possible. The image of the peasant girl who had risen to such heights through divine favor became one of the most powerful symbols of the day, representing the possibility that God could work through the humblest instruments to accomplish the greatest purposes. The transformation of Charles from Dauphin to king was immediately apparent to all who witnessed the ceremony. The uncertain, hesitant young man who had struggled to maintain his authority in the face of constant challenges emerged from the cathedral as a monarch who commanded respect and obedience. The sacred nature of the ceremony had worked its intended effect, creating a psychological transformation that would have lasting political consequences. The newly crowned king's first acts demonstrated his enhanced authority and confidence. He issued proclamations announcing his coronation to the realm and to foreign powers, asserting his divine right to rule and calling upon all Frenchmen to acknowledge his legitimacy. He also began to implement policies that had been impossible before his consecration, reorganizing the government and military while establishing diplomatic relations with potential allies who had previously been reluctant to recognize his authority. Joan's role in these developments was complex and sometimes contradictory. On one hand, her mission had been accomplished. The Dauphin had been crowned king at Reims, fulfilling the primary command she had received from her voices. On the other hand, her military leadership remained crucial to the ongoing war effort, as English forces continued to occupy large portions of French territory and showed no signs of abandoning their claims to the throne. The period immediately following the coronation saw Joan at the height of her influence and prestige. She had accomplished what had seemed impossible just months earlier, transforming the strategic situation of the war and providing France with a legitimately crowned king. Her reputation for supernatural powers was at its peak, with even skeptics forced to acknowledge that her predictions had been fulfilled and her military leadership had been spectacularly successful. Yet this very success created new challenges and expectations that would prove increasingly difficult to meet. The miraculous nature of her early achievements had created an aura of invincibility that made any subsequent failures seem particularly significant. The French began to expect that every battle would be won and every siege would succeed, while the English became increasingly desperate to prove that she could be defeated. The campaign that followed the coronation aimed to capitalize on the momentum created by Charles's consecration and to drive the English from the remaining territories they controlled in northern France. The immediate objective was the city of Compiègne, a strategic stronghold that controlled important river crossings and communication routes. The siege of Compiègne would test Joan's military abilities under more challenging conditions than those she had previously faced. The English response to the French successes had been swift and decisive. Fresh reinforcements were dispatched from England under the command of experienced military leaders, while new alliances were forged with Burgundian nobles who remained loyal to the English cause. The Duke of Bedford, regent for the young Henry VI, recognized that the war had reached a critical juncture and that failure to halt the French advance could result in the complete collapse of English authority in France. Joan's approach to the siege of Compiègne reflected her growing confidence and experience as a military commander. She coordinated the actions of multiple units while maintaining the moral leadership that had become her trademark, inspiring soldiers to fight with a dedication that transcended normal military discipline. Yet she also faced new challenges, as the English had adapted their tactics to counter the advantages that had made her previous campaigns so successful. The siege dragged on for weeks without the decisive breakthrough that had characterized Joan's earlier operations. The English garrison proved more resilient than expected, while reinforcements arriving from other English strongholds made the military situation increasingly complex. For the first time since Orléans, Joan found herself in a prolonged campaign where divine intervention seemed less immediately apparent than in her previous victories. The turning point came on May 23, 1430, during a sortie from Compiègne that was intended to break the siege once and for all. Joan led a charge against the English lines, but the attack was repulsed with heavy casualties. In the confusion of the retreat, Joan became separated from her main force and found herself surrounded by Burgundian soldiers who had been fighting as allies of the English. Despite her desperate efforts to fight her way clear, she was overwhelmed and captured. The capture of Joan of Arc sent shockwaves throughout France and beyond, as the seemingly invincible maiden who had transformed the course of the war was suddenly in the hands of her enemies. The psychological impact was immediate and profound, with French morale plummeting, while English and Burgundian forces celebrated what they saw as proof that her supernatural powers had been either illusory or withdrawn by divine judgment. The circumstances of Joan's capture were significant in themselves, as she had been taken not by the English directly, but by their Burgundian allies under the command of John of Luxembourg. This detail would prove crucial in determining her fate, as it raised complex questions about the legal and political status of her captivity. The Burgundians saw her primarily as a valuable prisoner who could be ransomed or exchanged, while the English viewed her as a dangerous enemy who needed to be eliminated permanently. The negotiations over Joan's fate revealed the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the political landscape of medieval France. The Burgundians initially hoped to use her as a bargaining chip in their own negotiations with the French crown, but English pressure and financial incentives ultimately convinced them to transfer her to English custody. The sum paid for her was reportedly 10,000 gold crowns, making her one of the most expensive prisoners in medieval history. Joan's transfer to English custody in November 1430 marked the beginning of the final phase of her extraordinary career. The English faced a delicate problem in dealing with their famous captive. as they needed to discredit her claims to divine mission, while avoiding the appearance of martyring a holy woman. Their solution was to arrange for her trial on charges of heresy and witchcraft, crimes that carried the death penalty, but that also provided a means of attacking her reputation and the legitimacy of her mission. The decision to try Joan for heresy, rather than simply executing her as a prisoner of war, reflected the English understanding that her greatest threat lay not in her military abilities, but in her symbolic power as a representative of divine favor for the French cause. By proving that she was a heretic and a witch, they hoped to demonstrate that her successes had been achieved through demonic rather than divine assistance, thereby discrediting the French monarchy that had benefited from her support. The trial was carefully orchestrated to achieve these political objectives, while maintaining the appearance of legitimate judicial proceedings. The court was composed of French clerics who were loyal to the English cause, led by Pierre Cauchon, Bishop of Beauvais, who had been driven from his diocese by Joan's military campaigns and who had personal as well as political reasons for seeking her condemnation. The proceedings were conducted according to the forms of canon law, but the outcome was predetermined by the political necessities that had motivated the trial. Joan's conduct during the trial revealed the same courage and conviction that had characterized her military career. Despite being chained in a prison cell and subjected to constant interrogation by learned theologians, she maintained her claims to divine mission and refused to repudiate the voices that had commanded her to save France. Her responses to the complex theological questions posed by her judges demonstrated a sophistication that impressed even her enemies, though they interpreted her persistence as evidence of diabolic influence rather than divine inspiration. The charges against Joan were numerous and complex, ranging from wearing men's clothing to claiming direct revelation from God. The most serious accusations involved her assertion that she received commands directly from saints and angels, which the court characterized as presumptuous and possibly heretical. The judges argued that such claims bypassed the authority of the Church and could lead to dangerous enthusiasm among the common people who might be inspired to similar presumptions. Joan's defense of her actions relied primarily on the fruits of her mission, arguing that the success of her campaigns and the coronation of the king provided evidence of divine approval for her calling. She maintained that her voices had never commanded her to do anything contrary to Christian faith, and that her ultimate goal had been to serve God by saving France from foreign domination. This argument, while theologically sound, failed to satisfy judges who were committed to finding her guilty regardless of the evidence presented. The trial proceedings extended over several months, with Joan subjected to repeated interrogations designed to trap her into admissions that could be used to justify her condemnation. The judges employed sophisticated theological arguments and legal technicalities to create contradictions in her testimony, while denying her the right to appeal to higher church authorities or to have advocates assist in her defense. The entire process was designed to create the appearance of justice while ensuring that the predetermined verdict could be reached. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Joan, exhausted by months of imprisonment and interrogation, temporarily abjured her claims and agreed to submit to church authority. This apparent recantation was seized upon by her judges as evidence of her guilt and of the falseness of her original claims. However, within days, Joan had withdrawn her abjuration, declaring that she had been wrong to deny the reality of her divine mission, and that she would rather die than live with such a betrayal of her calling. Joan's final recantation sealed her fate, as it provided the legal justification for her execution that the court had been seeking. She was declared a relapsed heretic and handed over to the secular authorities for punishment, as was customary in cases where the church had condemned someone to death but could not itself carry out the sentence. The death penalty for heresy was burning at the stake, a punishment that was intended to purify the soul through fire while serving as a warning to others who might be tempted to similar crimes. The execution of Joan of Arc took place on May 30th, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, before a crowd of thousands who had gathered to witness the final act of her extraordinary drama. She was led to the stake with dignity and courage, requesting that a cross be held before her eyes and calling upon the saints who had guided her throughout her mission. Her last words were reported to be, "Jesus," spoken as the flames consumed her body and released her spirit to whatever judgment awaited her beyond the grave. The immediate aftermath of Joan's execution was complex and contradictory. Her English captors celebrated what they saw as the final defeat of the French cause's most dangerous symbol, while many French observers viewed her death as martyrdom that would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken resistance to foreign domination. The psychological impact of her execution was profound but difficult to assess, as it took time for the full implications of her death to become apparent. The English had achieved their immediate objective of eliminating Joan as a military and political threat, but they had also created a powerful martyr whose memory would inspire French resistance for generations to come. The manner of her death, burned as a heretic after a trial that many observers considered unjust, enhanced rather than diminished her reputation for sanctity among those who had supported her cause. The very success of English efforts to discredit her served to confirm in the minds of her supporters that she had indeed been a threat to the forces of evil that they identified with foreign domination. King Charles VII's response to Joan's execution was notably restrained, reflecting the complex political calculations that governed his actions throughout his reign. While he undoubtedly regretted the loss of his most effective military commander, he was also aware that excessive grief or anger might be interpreted as confirmation of his dependence upon what his enemies claimed was diabolic assistance. His public reaction was therefore carefully measured, acknowledging Joan's service while avoiding any statements that might be used to support charges that his crown had been won through unholy means. The war continued for more than 2 decades after Joan's death, but its character had been fundamentally altered by her brief but spectacular career. The French had learned that English military supremacy was not absolute, and that properly motivated forces could achieve victory even against seemingly overwhelming odds. More importantly, the legitimacy crisis that had plagued the French monarchy had been resolved through Charles's coronation at Reims, providing a foundation for royal authority that would prove more durable than any military conquest. The gradual French recovery that followed Joan's death vindicated her strategic vision, as the English were slowly but steadily pushed back from the territories they had conquered during the previous decades. The siege of Orléans had marked the beginning of this recovery, while the coronation at Reims had provided the political foundation that made sustained resistance possible. Joan's military innovations, particularly her emphasis on moral discipline and her ability to inspire common soldiers, became permanent features of French military culture. The English position in France became increasingly untenable as French resistance strengthened and English resources were stretched to their limits. The cost of maintaining large armies in a hostile country proved prohibitive, while the psychological advantages that had sustained English forces in their early victories were gradually eroded by repeated defeats. The death of John, Duke of Bedford, in 1435, removed the most capable English commander and marked the beginning of a precipitous decline in English fortunes. The defection of the Duke of Burgundy from the English alliance in 1435 represented a decisive turning point in the war, as it deprived the English of their most important continental ally while providing the French with access to the wealthy Burgundian territories. The Treaty of Arras, which formalized this alliance, was negotiated without English participation and marked the effective end of the Grand Coalition that had once seemed capable of permanently dividing France between English and Burgundian control. The final phases of the war saw a series of French victories that systematically eliminated English strongholds throughout northern France. Normandy, the ancestral home of English power in France, was conquered in a rapid campaign that demonstrated how completely the strategic balance had shifted since Joan's time. The capture of Rouen in 1449, the very city where Joan had been executed, seemed to symbolize the ultimate vindication of her cause and the futility of English efforts to maintain their continental empire. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the effective end of the 100 Years' War, as the last English field army in France was destroyed by French forces using the innovative artillery tactics that had been developed during the long conflict. The English evacuation of Bordeaux later that year left them with only Calais as a reminder of their former dominance, while France emerged as the most powerful and unified kingdom in Europe. The transformation of France during the decades following Joan's death was remarkable in its scope and permanence. The kingdom that had seemed on the verge of collapse in 1429 became the dominant power in European politics, with a strong monarchy, a professional army, and a growing sense of national identity that transcended regional and feudal loyalties. The economic recovery that accompanied military success created the wealth necessary to support royal ambitions and to fund the cultural achievements that would characterize the French Renaissance. Joan's role in this transformation was both direct and indirect, as her military victories had provided the foundation for French recovery, while her symbolic significance continued to inspire resistance long after her death. The peasant girl who had claimed divine mission had succeeded in accomplishing what the greatest nobles and most experienced commanders had failed to achieve, demonstrating that God could indeed work through the humblest instruments to accomplish the greatest purposes. The process of Joan's rehabilitation began during her own lifetime, as those who had supported her cause began to collect evidence that would challenge the verdict of the trial that had condemned her. The theological arguments used to justify her execution were examined by scholars who reached different conclusions about the validity of her claims to divine mission. The political circumstances that had motivated her trial were gradually revealed, casting doubt on the impartiality of the judges who had pronounced her guilty of heresy. King Charles VII himself played a crucial role in this rehabilitation, commissioning a formal investigation into the circumstances of Joan's trial and execution. This investigation, which began in 1449 and concluded in 1456, heard testimony from dozens of witnesses who had known Joan personally or who had participated in various aspects of her career. The evidence presented painted a picture of the trial as a political proceeding disguised as a religious tribunal, conducted by judges who were committed to reaching a predetermined verdict regardless of the facts presented. The rehabilitation trial concluded with a formal reversal of the original verdict, declaring that Joan had been unjustly condemned and that her claims to divine mission were consistent with Orthodox Christian doctrine. The judges who had condemned her were criticized for their bias and their failure to follow proper legal procedures, while Joan herself was praised for her virtue and her service to the French crown. The rehabilitation did not formally declare her a saint, but it removed the stigma of heresy that had been attached to her memory. The impact of Joan's story extended far beyond the immediate political and military consequences of her career. Her example inspired countless individuals who saw in her proof that God could call anyone, regardless of social status or gender, to perform extraordinary deeds in his service. The image of the peasant girl who had risen to command armies and crown kings became a powerful symbol of the possibility that divine grace could transform even the humblest circumstances. The cultural legacy of Joan's story was equally significant, as writers, artists, and musicians found in her life a subject that combined historical drama with spiritual meaning. The figure of the warrior maiden who had sacrificed everything for her country and her faith became a standard theme in European literature, inspiring works that ranged from simple ballads to sophisticated theological treatises. The visual arts also embraced her story, with countless paintings and sculptures depicting her in various moments of her extraordinary career. The political significance of Joan's legacy evolved over the centuries as different groups found in her story confirmation of their own beliefs and aspirations. French nationalists saw her as the founder of their country's independence and the embodiment of patriotic virtue, while religious reformers viewed her as an example of direct divine calling that bypassed traditional ecclesiastical authority. Feminists identified her as a pioneer who had challenged gender roles and demonstrated women's capacity for leadership in spheres traditionally reserved for men. The Catholic Church's recognition of Joan as a saint in 1920 represented the culmination of a long process of theological evaluation that had begun with her rehabilitation in the 15th century. The canonization process required extensive investigation of her life and alleged miracles, examining evidence that ranged from medieval documents to contemporary testimonies of divine intervention attributed to her intercession. The formal declaration of her sanctity confirmed what many had believed for centuries, that she had indeed been chosen by God for a special mission, and that her death had been a martyrdom rather than a just execution. Joan's feast day, celebrated on May 30th, the anniversary of her execution, became an occasion for reflection on the themes that her life had embodied: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, faith in divine providence, and dedication to serving the common good despite personal cost. The prayers and devotions that developed around her memory emphasized these virtues while asking for her intercession in times of national crisis or personal trial. The historical study of Joan's life and career has continued to evolve as new sources have been discovered and new analytical methods have been applied to familiar evidence. Modern historians have attempted to separate the facts of her biography from the legends that grew up around her memory, while also examining the social and cultural context that made her extraordinary career possible. These studies have revealed the complexity of her personality and the sophistication of her political and military thinking, while confirming the basic accuracy of the traditional accounts of her major achievements. Archaeological investigations have added new dimensions to our understanding of Joan's world, revealing details about the material culture of medieval France that help explain how a peasant girl could have acquired the skills and knowledge necessary for military leadership. The study of armor, weapons, and fortifications from her period has illuminated the technical aspects of her campaigns, while examination of religious artifacts has provided insight into the spiritual world that shaped her understanding of her mission. The question of Joan's voices and visions continues to intrigue scholars and believers alike, as it touches on fundamental questions about the nature of religious experience and the possibility of divine intervention in human affairs. Various theories have been proposed to explain her claims, from divine revelation to psychological disorders to deliberate fraud, but none has been definitively proven. The mystery remains, as it perhaps must, given the extraordinary nature of the claims and the distance in time that separates us from the events themselves. What cannot be disputed is the transformative impact of Joan's brief career on the course of European history. Her military victories turned the tide of the 100 Years' War and established the foundation for French recovery and unification. Her symbolic significance as a divinely inspired leader provided legitimacy for the French monarchy and inspiration for generations of patriots. Her example as a woman who had achieved authority in spheres traditionally reserved for men challenged gender assumptions and opened new possibilities for female leadership. The story of Joan of Arc thus transcends the boundaries of any single historical period or cultural context, touching on universal themes that continue to resonate in our own time. Her life demonstrates the power of conviction and courage to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, while her death illustrates the price that such convictions sometimes exact from those who hold them. Her legacy reminds us that individuals can indeed change the course of history, but only through sacrifice and dedication that most of us can barely imagine. In the end, Joan of Arc remains what she claimed to be, a simple peasant girl who heard voices commanding her to save France and who was willing to risk everything to obey those commands. Whether those voices came from heaven, from her own subconscious mind, or from some other source may never be definitively established. What matters is that she heard them, believed them, and acted upon them with a courage and determination that transformed not only her own life, but the destiny of nations. The final chapter of Joan's story is still being written, as each generation finds in her example new meanings and new inspiration. She remains a figure who transcends the boundaries of time and culture, speaking to universal human aspirations for justice, freedom, and the possibility that even the humblest among us can be called to greatness. Her story reminds us that history is not merely the record of great events and powerful individuals, but the story of how ordinary people, when touched by extraordinary purpose, can change the world forever. The centuries that followed Joan's death witnessed the gradual transformation of her memory from controversial figure to beloved saint, a process that reflected the changing nature of French society and European Christianity. In the immediate aftermath of her execution, her story was preserved primarily through oral tradition, passed down among the common people who had seen in her someone who represented their own hopes and aspirations. These folk memories, while sometimes embellished in the telling, maintained the essential truth of her extraordinary career and kept alive the conviction that she had indeed been chosen by God for a special purpose. The scholarly investigation of Joan's life began in earnest during the Renaissance, as humanist historians sought to recover the true facts of her biography from the layers of legend that had accumulated around her memory. These early studies, while limited by the documentary sources available to them, established many of the basic facts that continue to form the foundation of historical understanding. They also began the process of critical evaluation that would eventually lead to her formal rehabilitation and canonization. The Protestant Reformation brought new complexity to the interpretation of Joan's story, as reformers questioned the Catholic doctrine of saintly intercession, while often admiring her example of direct divine calling that bypassed traditional ecclesiastical authority. Some Protestant writers saw in her a precursor of their own emphasis on individual religious experience, while others criticized the Catholic Church's eventual canonization of someone who had claimed to receive revelations outside of Scripture. These debates reflected broader theological controversies about the nature of religious authority and the possibility of continuing revelation. Catholic counter-Reformation scholars responded by emphasizing Joan's orthodoxy and her submission to church authority, arguing that her visions were consistent with established patterns of mystical experience and that her mission had been validated by its successful accomplishment. They also stressed her devotion to the Mass and the sacraments, her veneration of saints, and her acceptance of clerical guidance, presenting her as a model of Catholic piety rather than a challenge to ecclesiastical order. The Age of Enlightenment brought yet another perspective to Joan's story, as rationalist philosophers attempted to explain her achievements through natural rather than supernatural causes. Some suggested that she had been a clever politician who had manipulated religious sentiment for patriotic purposes, while others argued that her visions were the product of mental illness or deliberate deception. These interpretations, while often reductive, contributed to a more nuanced understanding of the social and political contexts that had made her career possible. Voltaire's famous poem, La Pucelle, represented perhaps the most extreme example of Enlightenment skepticism toward Joan's religious claims, presenting her as a naive peasant girl who had been manipulated by cynical politicians for their own purposes. While this interpretation was widely criticized even in its own time, it reflected the broader Enlightenment project of subjecting traditional religious narratives to rational scrutiny and seeking natural explanations for for seemingly miraculous events. The French Revolution brought Joan's story into sharp political focus, as revolutionaries sought historical precedents for their own struggle against royal authority, while simultaneously grappling with her role as a supporter of the monarchy. Some revolutionaries embraced her as a champion of the common people who had challenged aristocratic privilege, while others condemned her as a tool of royal oppression. The complexity of these interpretations reflected the difficulty of fitting her story into the ideological frameworks of revolutionary politics. Napoleon's rise to power marked a significant turning point in the official French attitude toward Joan, as the emperor recognized her value as a symbol of French nationalism and military glory. He commissioned paintings and sculptures celebrating her achievements while promoting historical studies that emphasized her role in establishing French independence and unity. This appropriation of her memory for political purposes established a pattern that would be repeated by subsequent French governments of various political orientations. The 19th century witnessed an extraordinary flowering of artistic and literary works inspired by Joan's story, as romantic writers and artists found in her life themes that perfectly embodied their movement's values. The combination of individual heroism, supernatural experience, and tragic fate appealed strongly to romantic sensibilities, while her humble origins and authentic emotion contrasted favorably with the artificial conventions that had dominated earlier artistic periods. Friedrich Schiller's drama Die Jungfrau von Orléans presented Joan as a romantic heroine whose pure love of country and uncompromising devotion to principle ultimately led to her destruction by a corrupt world. While taking considerable liberties with historical fact, Schiller's play captured essential aspects of Joan's character and established many of the themes that would continue to influence artistic treatments of her story. The French composer Charles Gounod's opera Jeanne d'Arc further developed these romantic themes, using music to convey the mystical dimensions of Joan's experience while exploring the psychological tensions between her human desires and her divine calling. The opera's popularity throughout Europe demonstrated the universal appeal of her story while contributing to the growing movement for her formal canonization. Visual artists of the 19th century created countless images of Joan that emphasized different aspects of her character and mission. Some depicted her as a warrior maiden in gleaming armor, emphasizing her military achievements and her challenge to gender conventions. Others portrayed her as a peasant visionary, surrounded by supernatural light and communing with angelic figures. Still others focused on her trial and execution, presenting her as a Christian martyr who had suffered for truth and justice. The development of photography and then cinema in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created new possibilities for presenting Joan's story to mass audiences. Early films about her life, while technically primitive by later standards, succeeded in conveying the drama and emotional power of her career to viewers who might never have encountered her story through traditional literary or artistic means. These visual media also contributed to the standardization of her image, creating iconic representations that became deeply embedded in popular culture. The process of Joan's canonization, which culminated in 1920, represented the culmination of centuries of theological investigation and popular devotion. The formal procedures required by canon law involved exhaustive examination of all available evidence about her life, her virtues, and the miracles attributed to her intercession. Teams of theologians, historians, and other experts spent decades analyzing every aspect of her career, seeking to determine whether she met the Church's strict criteria for sainthood. The theological questions surrounding Joan's case were particularly complex because of the unusual nature of her mission and the controversial circumstances of her death. The canonization process required definitive resolution of long-standing debates about the authenticity of her visions, the orthodoxy of her beliefs, and the legitimacy of her claim to divine calling. The ultimate decision to proceed with canonization represented a formal endorsement of the view that she had indeed been chosen by God for a special purpose, and that her execution had been a martyrdom rather than a just punishment. The ceremony of canonization itself, conducted by Pope Benedict XV in St. Peter's Basilica on May 16, 1920, was attended by thousands of pilgrims from around the world and marked the culmination of Joan's transformation from controversial historical figure to officially recognized saint. The timing of the canonization, coming so soon after the end of World War I, seemed particularly appropriate, as many saw parallels between Joan's defense of France against foreign invasion and the recent struggle against German occupation. The impact of Joan's canonization extended far beyond the Catholic Church, as it provided official validation for her story that influenced secular as well as religious interpretations of her significance. The declaration of her sainthood lent additional weight to scholarly arguments about her historical importance, while inspiring new waves of artistic and literary creativity. It also enhanced her value as a symbol of French national identity, providing religious sanction for patriotic devotion that transcended partisan political divisions. The two world wars of the 20th century brought new relevance to Joan's example, as French resistance fighters and Allied forces found inspiration in her story of successful resistance against overwhelming odds. During World War II, both the Vichy government and the Free French claimed her legacy, each arguing that their cause represented the true continuation of her patriotic mission. The complexity of these competing claims reflected the difficulty of appropriating historical figures for contemporary political purposes, while honoring the authentic meaning of their lives. Charles de Gaulle's invocation of Joan during his leadership of the French resistance demonstrated the enduring power of her symbol to inspire national unity and determination in times of crisis. His famous appeal of June 18, 1940, calling upon French people to continue resistance against Nazi occupation, deliberately echoed themes from Joan's career while presenting contemporary struggle as a continuation of her historic mission to preserve French independence and dignity. The liberation of France in 1944 was celebrated in ways that consciously recalled Joan's victories 5 centuries earlier, with ceremonies at Reims and other sites associated with her memory. The parallel between medieval resistance to English occupation and modern resistance to German occupation seemed obvious to many participants, while the ultimate success of both struggles appeared to validate the conviction that France enjoyed special divine protection in times of national crisis. The post-war period brought new scholarly approaches to Joan's story, as historians began to apply more sophisticated analytical methods to the study of her life and times. Social historians examined the economic and demographic contexts that had shaped medieval France, while cultural historians investigated the religious and intellectual frameworks that had made her extraordinary career possible. These studies revealed the complexity of medieval society while confirming the remarkable nature of Joan's individual achievements. Feminist scholars of the late 20th century found in Joan's story a powerful example of female agency and leadership that challenged traditional gender roles and demonstrated women's capacity for extraordinary achievement. These interpretations emphasized her defiance of social conventions, her assumption of authority in traditionally male spheres, and her success in gaining acceptance for her unconventional claims to power. While acknowledging the unique circumstances that had made her career possible, feminist historians argued that her example provided important insights into the potential for women's leadership in any historical period. Psychological studies of Joan's personality and experiences have attempted to understand the mental and emotional factors that enabled her to accomplish what she did. Some researchers have focused on her visionary experiences, seeking to explain them through various theoretical frameworks, ranging from religious mysticism to psychological disorders. Others have examined her leadership abilities, analyzing the personal qualities that allowed her to inspire loyalty and confidence among followers who had no previous experience with female military commanders. The advent of computer technology and digital media has created new possibilities for studying and presenting Joan's story to contemporary audiences. Historical databases have made vast amounts of documentary evidence available to researchers around the world, while computer modeling has enabled more sophisticated analysis of medieval military tactics and strategic decisions. Virtual reality and other immersive technologies have begun to offer new ways of experiencing the historical environments in which she lived and fought. Archaeological investigations continue to yield new insights into the material culture of Joan's world, revealing details about daily life in medieval France that help modern audiences understand the context in which her extraordinary career unfolded. Excavations at sites associated with her life have uncovered artifacts that illuminate everything from military technology to religious practices, while scientific analysis of surviving documents and objects has provided new information about the practical circumstances of her mission. The globalization of communication has spread awareness of Joan's story to cultures and societies far removed from medieval Europe, where her example continues to inspire individuals facing their own struggles for justice and freedom. Her story has been adapted for audiences in Asia, Africa, and the Americas, each finding in her experience themes that resonate with their own histories and aspirations. These cross-cultural interpretations have enriched understanding of her universal significance while demonstrating the timeless appeal of her example. Modern pilgrimage to sites associated with Joan's life has become a significant phenomenon, with thousands of visitors annually traveling to Domrémy, Orléans, Reims, and Rouen to walk in her footsteps and reflect on her legacy. These pilgrimages combine historical interest with spiritual seeking, as visitors hope to gain insight into both the facts of her biography and the deeper meaning of her extraordinary career. The continued vitality of these pilgrimages demonstrates the enduring power of her story to inspire and transform those who encounter it. Contemporary artistic interpretations of Joan's story continue to explore new dimensions of her character and significance, with recent works examining themes of religious experience, gender identity, political authority, and cultural difference. Modern playwrights, filmmakers, and novelists have found in her life a subject that allows exploration of fundamental questions about human nature and divine purpose, while musicians and visual artists continue to create works that capture different aspects of her extraordinary personality and mission. The digital age has also enabled new forms of collaborative scholarship, with researchers from around the world contributing to ongoing investigations of Joan's life and times. Online databases and discussion forums have facilitated international cooperation in analysing historical evidence, while digital reconstruction projects have created virtual models of the places and events associated with her career. These technological developments have accelerated the pace of scholarly discovery, while making the results accessible to broader audiences than ever before. Educational programs about Joan's life have proliferated at all levels, from elementary schools to universities, as educators recognize the value of her story for teaching about medieval history, religious experience, gender roles, and individual achievement. These programs often combine historical study with character education, using her example to illustrate virtues such as courage, integrity, and perseverance that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. The commercialization of Joan's image and story reflects both the popularity of her legend and the challenges of maintaining authentic understanding of her historical significance. Tourist industries in France promote visits to sites associated with her life, while commercial products ranging from books to films to collectibles capitalize on public interest in her story. These developments have helped spread awareness of her legacy while sometimes simplifying or distorting the complex realities of her actual career. International commemorations of significant anniversaries in Joan's life continue to demonstrate her global significance and the universal appeal of her story. The 500th anniversary of her death in 1931, the 600th anniversary of her birth in 2012, and similar milestones have occasioned scholarly conferences, artistic festivals, and religious observances that bring together people from many nations and backgrounds who find inspiration in her example. The study of Joan's influence on later historical figures reveals the continuing impact of her example on individuals who face their own challenges and sought guidance from her story. Leaders ranging from Napoleon to Winston Churchill have cited her as an inspiration, while countless ordinary people have found in her life encouragement to persevere through their own difficulties. This pattern of influence demonstrates how individual stories can transcend their original contexts to provide guidance and inspiration across centuries and cultures. Scientific advances continue to provide new tools for investigating aspects of Joan's story that were previously inaccessible to historical research. Carbon dating and other analytical techniques have enabled more precise dating of artifacts and documents, while DNA analysis has occasionally provided insights into family relationships and population movements during her era. These scientific methods complement traditional historical research while opening new avenues for understanding the world in which she lived. The preservation of sites and artifacts associated with Joan's life has become a significant cultural undertaking, with governments and private organizations investing substantial resources in maintaining the physical heritage of her story. Museums dedicated to her memory display original documents, weapons, and other objects that provide tangible connections to her actual experience, while careful conservation of historical buildings ensures that future generations will be able to encounter the environments in which she lived and worked. Contemporary theological reflection on Joan's significance continues to explore the implications of her canonization and the meaning of her example for modern Christian life. Catholic scholars examine her relevance for understanding divine calling and lay ministry, while ecumenical dialogues consider what her story might teach about religious authority and spiritual discernment. These theological investigations contribute to ongoing development of Christian doctrine, while honoring the authentic witness of her extraordinary life. The psychological dimensions of Joan's story continue to fascinate researchers and general audiences alike, as her transformation from peasant girl to military leader represents one of history's most dramatic examples of personal development under extreme circumstances. Studies of her mental and emotional resilience provide insights into human potential and the factors that enable some individuals to achieve extraordinary things despite overwhelming obstacles. Comparative studies of Joan with other historical figures who claimed divine missions or who achieved remarkable things against great odds have helped place her story in broader historical and cultural contexts. These comparisons reveal both the unique aspects of her particular experience and the universal patterns that characterize exceptional human achievement across different times and places. The role of women in medieval society continues to be illuminated by study of Joan's career, as historians examine how she was able to transcend the normal limitations placed on female participation in public life. Her success in gaining acceptance as a military leader and political advisor provides valuable evidence about the flexibility of medieval gender roles and the possibilities for women's agency even within patriarchal societies. Military historians continue to analyze Joan's campaigns and tactical innovations, seeking to understand how she was able to achieve such remarkable success despite her lack of formal training. Her emphasis on moral discipline, her ability to inspire troops, and her integration of religious and military objectives provide lessons that remain relevant for understanding leadership and motivation in any context. The economic aspects of Joan's career have attracted increasing scholarly attention, as researchers examine the financial costs of her campaigns and the economic factors that influence their success or failure. The relationship between military effectiveness and economic resources in medieval warfare provides important context for understanding both her achievements and their limitations. Cultural historians continue to investigate the symbolic dimensions of Joan's story, examining how her image and memory have been used to represent various ideals and aspirations throughout the centuries since her death. These studies reveal how historical figures become cultural symbols and how their meaning evolves in response to changing social and political circumstances. The international dimensions of Joan's story have become more apparent as scholars examine her impact on relationships between France and other European powers. Her success in driving out English forces and legitimizing French royal authority had consequences that extended far beyond France itself, influencing the development of national identity and sovereign authority throughout medieval and early modern Europe. Modern technology has enabled new forms of artistic expression inspired by Joan's story, with digital artists, video game designers, and multimedia creators finding innovative ways to present her life to contemporary audiences. These new media forms reach audiences that might not encounter her story through traditional books or films, while offering immersive experiences that can convey aspects of her world that were previously difficult to communicate. The philosophical implications of Joan's story continue to generate discussion among thinkers interested in questions of authority, inspiration, and the relationship between individual conviction and social responsibility. Her claim to divine calling raises fundamental questions about the sources of moral and political authority that remain relevant in contemporary debates about leadership and legitimacy. Environmental historians have begun to examine the ecological contexts of Joan's world, investigating how climate change, agricultural practices, and natural disasters influenced the social and economic conditions that shaped her career. These studies provide new perspectives on the relationship between human history and natural environment, while illuminating the material conditions that made her extraordinary achievements possible. The study of memory and commemoration has found in Joan's story a rich case study of how societies preserve and transmit historical narratives across generations. The evolution of her legend from oral tradition to written history to popular culture demonstrates the complex processes through which historical memory is constructed and maintained. Medical historians have investigated the health conditions that prevailed in Joan's time, providing context for understanding both her physical resilience and the challenges she faced. Studies of medieval medicine, nutrition, and disease help modern audiences appreciate the harsh realities of life in her era, while highlighting the remarkable nature of her achievements. The linguistic dimensions of Joan's story continue to interest scholars, as her use of various dialects and languages provides evidence about communication patterns in medieval France. Her ability to communicate effectively with people from different regions and social classes was crucial to her success and offers insights into the cultural unity that she helped create. Archaeological evidence continues to emerge from sites associated with Joan's campaigns, providing new information about medieval military technology, urban development, and material culture. These discoveries complement documentary sources while offering direct physical evidence of the world in which she lived and fought. The legal aspects of Joan's trial and rehabilitation have attracted ongoing scholarly attention, as they provide important evidence about medieval judicial procedures and concepts of justice. The contrast between the politically motivated trial that condemned her and the careful legal process that eventually cleared her name illustrates the complex relationship between law and politics in medieval society. Contemporary discussions of heroism and leadership often reference Joan's example, as her story provides a compelling case study of how individuals can inspire others to achieve extraordinary things. Leadership training programs and motivational speakers frequently cite her career as an example of how vision, courage, and determination can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The study of Joan's religious experience continues to attract attention from scholars interested in mysticism, revelation, and the psychology of religious belief. Her visions and voices represent one of history's best documented cases of claimed divine communication, providing valuable evidence for understanding the nature and significance of such experiences. International relations scholars have examined Joan's career as an early example of how individual leaders can influence the development of national identity and sovereign authority. Her success in legitimizing French royal power and inspiring resistance to foreign domination provides insights into the emergence of the modern nation-state system. The preservation of documentary evidence related to Joan's life has become a significant scholarly undertaking, with archivists and librarians working to ensure that historical records remain accessible to future researchers. Digital preservation projects have made many of these documents available online, democratizing access to primary sources while facilitating new forms of collaborative research. Educational innovations continue to find new ways to make Joan's story accessible and relevant to contemporary students, with interactive technologies, simulation games, and immersive experiences offering alternatives to traditional textbook learning. These approaches recognize that understanding historical figures requires engagement with both factual information and imaginative reconstruction of their experiences. The tourist industry's promotion of Joan-related sites has had mixed effects on historical understanding, creating economic incentives for preservation, while sometimes encouraging simplified or commercialized presentations of her story. Balancing popular accessibility with scholarly accuracy remains an ongoing challenge for those responsible for interpreting her legacy to public audiences. Contemporary art therapy and therapeutic practices sometimes reference Joan's story as an example of how individuals can find strength and purpose through connection with transcendent values. Her transformation from an uncertain young woman to a confident leader provides a model for personal growth and self-actualization that resonates with modern therapeutic approaches. The study of medieval warfare has been enriched by analysis of Joan's military innovations, particularly her emphasis on siege warfare and her integration of artillery with traditional cavalry and infantry tactics. Her campaigns provide important evidence about the evolution of military technology and strategy during the transition from medieval to early modern warfare. Anthropological studies of Joan's cultural context have examined the social structures and belief systems that made her extraordinary career possible, while also investigating how her example influenced subsequent developments in French society. These studies reveal the complex interactions between individual agency and cultural determination that shaped her life and legacy. The psychological study of charismatic leadership has found in Joan's career one of history's most compelling examples of how individuals can inspire others to transcend normal limitations and achieve extraordinary things. Her ability to motivate soldiers, convince nobles, and maintain popular support despite her humble origins provides valuable insights into the nature of charisma and its effects. Contemporary discussions of gender and leadership continue to reference Joan's example as evidence of women's capacity for authority and achievement in traditionally male-dominated spheres. Her success in gaining acceptance as a military commander challenges assumptions about gender roles while providing inspiration for women seeking leadership positions in various fields. The study of political legitimacy has found in Joan's career an important case study of how divine sanction and popular support can combine to create or restore governmental authority. Her role in legitimizing Charles VII's monarchy provides insights into the sources of political power that remain relevant for understanding contemporary governance. Modern conflict resolution and peace-building efforts sometimes reference Joan's approach to warfare, particularly her emphasis on moral discipline and her attempts to minimize casualties. Her integration of military action with diplomatic communication provides lessons for those seeking to achieve political objectives while maintaining ethical standards. The preservation of oral traditions related to Joan's story has become a focus of ethnographic research as scholars seek to understand how folk memory preserves and transmits historical narratives across generations. These studies reveal the complex relationship between official history and popular memory, while highlighting the continuing vitality of her legend. Contemporary theology continues to grapple with the implications of Joan's canonization and the meaning of her example for understanding divine calling and human response to transcendent authority. Her story raises fundamental questions about the nature of religious experience that remain relevant for believers seeking to understand their own relationship with the divine. The environmental movement has occasionally appropriated Joan's image as a symbol of resistance to destructive forces and commitment to protecting what is valued and sacred. Her defense of French soil against foreign occupation provides a metaphor for contemporary efforts to protect natural environments against various forms of degradation. In the gentle twilight of understanding that settles over all human stories when they have been told completely and contemplated deeply, Joan of Arc emerges not merely as a historical figure or religious symbol, but as a perpetual reminder of the mysterious capacity of the human spirit to transcend its apparent limitations and achieve the seemingly impossible. Her brief life, spanning less than 20 years, continues to illuminate truths about courage, faith, and determination that speak to every generation with undiminished power and relevance. The peasant girl who heard voices in her father's garden and died in the flames of Rouen has become eternal in ways she could never have imagined. Her story transcending the particular circumstances of medieval France to become a universal testament to the possibility that any life, however humble its origins, can serve purposes greater than individual ambition or desire. In her transformation from village maiden to warrior saint, she embodies the deepest human hope that existence has meaning, that suffering serves purpose, and that death itself cannot extinguish the light of a life lived in service to transcendent truth. The centuries have validated her conviction that God works through human instruments to accomplish divine purposes, as her brief career continues to inspire countless individuals to find courage in their own struggles and to believe that they too might be called to serve causes greater than themselves. The echoes of her story resonate in every act of heroism, every moment of moral courage, and every instance where individuals choose principle over comfort, duty over safety, and service over self-interest. In the quiet countryside of medieval France, where ancient oaks still whisper secrets of centuries past, and stone churches continue to reach toward heaven, like prayers made manifest, the memory of Joan of Arc endures not as a relic of the past, but as a living presence that speaks to the eternal dimensions of human existence. She who emerged from that timeless landscape to command armies and crown kings has returned to it in legend and in spirit, her story woven into the very fabric of the land she loved and served, and beyond that, into the larger story of humanity's endless quest for meaning, purpose, and communion with the divine mystery that gives life its ultimate significance.